We look at what's happening in the United States. Claims by Donald Trump that white South Africans are being persecuted. They've reignited debate about race and migration once again. But reporting by Reuters actually suggests a more complex picture, including cases of white South Africans who left the country and are now returning, saying life abroad did not meet their expectations. I'm joined now by Tim Cox, Reuters Southern Africa Chief Correspondent and author of Lagos, Portrait of Africa's Biggest Metropolis, to unpack what the report actually found and how it fits into the broader political narrative around South Africa. Tim, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening.
So let's just talk about this article. Does it really challenge the narrative that white South Africans are fleeing persecution? What did your reporting actually find about the migratory pattern, given the fact that now white South Africans are being given refugee status in the United States?
Well, there was still a net outflow of white South Africans. But the point is really that an awful lot of white South Africans have gone over to Europe, to the United States, to Australia, and found that, the grass is not necessarily greener over that side, and have come back because a lot of things about South Africa are better. The weather is better. The cost of living in certain aspects, certainly when it comes to housing, is better. And they've gone over there, had an adventure, and realized that they miss home. And really that this was kind of a kind of counter narrative to the idea that there was this kind of wide scale systematic persecution of white South Africans going on, because if that was true, presumably they would stay where they were.
And Tim, in this case, there was a case study of a man who left South Africa, particularly the Western Cape, because of a violent incident that he said he experienced, moved his family, I think, to California. Just tell us a little bit more about this particular case study.
So he did leave basically because he was a victim of a violent crime. He was held up at gunpoint, something which is not, unfortunately, not hugely uncommon in South Africa, though, of course, it doesn't, mostly affect white people. And he went over there and actually had a great time, really enjoyed it. And then very, very recently, as things started to get more unsettling, with kind of, masked ICE agents abducting people in the street and shooting people in broad daylight, he just decided, actually, I'm not sure if this is where I want to be anymore. And so he's not actually come back yet. He's still looking to come back. But it was just an example of how, you're leaving violence, but actually there's also violence in the United States and in other countries as well.
And as you say, Tim, that what he experienced in South Africa is not just something that affects white South Africans. I mean, just looking at the demographics alone, it's quite ridiculous to even suggest that it's white people who are under persecution. What do they think about the life that they had before? Because just reading his comments, he's talking about how, in America, people just say there's mass shooting, people can get shot in the malls. So this turnaround in thinking, is it also just a lack of understanding of the context within which one is, or is it just, a dawning of everyday life of everyday people in whatever country you're in?
I mean, mass shootings are obviously something that hits the headlines in the United States, and I'm sure that if you live there, it's something that makes you think twice. It's gun violence is obviously a problem there, but of course, we can't shy away from the fact that there's murder is a huge problem in South Africa, and gun violence too. And the police statistics every year often come out with something roughly around 20,000 murders every year. The main point, though, is that most of the victims are black and usually from poor neighborhoods, because white people can afford better security. I'm not saying that there are farm murders, that does happen, but if you look at the statistics, it just doesn't stack up. The main victims of violent crime in South Africa are white farmers or white people in general.
But you did mention that also there is evidence of a return trend from not just the US, but in other countries as well. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this? And is it a measurable shift, or are these isolated cases?
We did struggle to find data to support the idea that there was a sort of sudden surge in people coming back. But there was certainly anecdotal evidence that there's a lot of interest in people who are abroad, and Europe and the United States are in a time that feels like a kind of time of crisis. That you've got the rise of the far right, you've got political polarization, you've got the rising cost of living, and whatever the reasons were that people decided it would be more peaceful and more prosperous over there, are starting to look a little bit more shaky. And, when you've got sort of what looks like kind of almost World War III happening in Eurasia, maybe being somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere with good weather and, a nice environment isn't such a bad idea. And I think that was the idea, that people sort of felt that. And it wasn't necessarily that people were only going over there because they felt that there was no future in South Africa. That's actually, of course, there were some people, but a lot of people just went over for an adventure, right? But they just realized that they miss home. And actually, there's also a feeling that things are kind of improving here, especially since the power cuts are getting any better.
I mean, Tim, there's reality versus perception, and I'd like to just get your views, not only as a journalist, but you have, your own proximity to South Africa. Your parents were anti-apartheid, activists. They left South Africa in the 70s before you were born. So from a perspective of a white South African, the narrative that is being painted, particularly in the US, and some of those who are going there and, spewing these narratives, just what are your thoughts about how the world sees South Africa and understands the complex nature of a crime in South Africa?
See, I guess the problem with this whole thing is what do we mean by the world? Because the world no longer sees things in one way. Everything is now so polarized that different people will look at the same event and see it completely differently. Like, some people will look at what was happening in Palestine and say, oh, that's a genocide. And other people will look at exactly the same event and say, no, it's not. And so, because of this polarization, just getting basic facts straight is quite difficult. But effectively, yes, there is a narrative about South Africa out there that has been circulating in far-right chat rooms for a long time, that kind of irritated me, because my parents, were against apartheid, and they left South Africa for that reason. And they definitely didn't go to a better life. They went to a smaller house, smaller garden, not very abundant with cash, and also, certainly nothing like a swimming pool or anything like that. All these kind of luxuries that an awful lot of white people, certainly not all, were enjoying under apartheid. And they left that behind because they didn't agree with the system. They didn't want to profit from the status quo. And so to now have people say, oh, white people are persecuted, when, especially post-apartheid, most of us have kept our privileges. And it just kind of got on my nerves a little bit, but it didn't really matter as long as it was just them talking amongst themselves. Once you've got the ear of the most powerful man in the country and of the far right in Europe and the Republican Party, then you can start to shape the narrative in the world. And so an awful lot of people have an extremely confused, just wrong perception of what's actually happening in South Africa.
But as you say, there is a bigger conversation, and that is about a changing world order, debates about multipolarity, because even in the UK, where you are, conversations around policy and immigration politics are a big discussion point, and how they affect ordinary families who believe that they don't have work or they don't earn enough because of migratory patterns. Does the ordinary person on the street care to understand the context behind some of these things?
It's not I'm not sure whether that they. I think it would be maybe a bit unfair to say that they don't care, but there's certainly an awful lot of people have been misled about the reasons why they are suffering things like high cost of living, more difficulty getting a job, not being able to make ends meet as well as they could. And it's very easy to blame, the outsider, the immigrants, and of course this is also a problem in South Africa in a very different way. But I do feel like there is a narrative out there in Europe and America, this kind of resurgent white supremacy, this sense of white entitlement. And when we see that we're no longer the kind of natural kind of I don't want to say sort of master race, that sounds a bit too extreme, but when we see that there are people who can do well who are from other races and who are have come up from different backgrounds, and that this is partly because of a change in attitudes, there's suddenly this kind of backlash. And I think it all took us by surprise because we were kind of stuck in our own little liberal bubble, in our own echo chambers, that we didn't realize that there was this huge sort of resurgence in far right white supremacist thinking, which has now taken over. I don't want to say it's taken over the world, but it's certainly taken over maybe 30% of the electorate in quite a lot of Europe and quite a lot of the United States. And it just, it made me think that all this progress that we thought we'd made since the end of apartheid, South Africa being an obvious kind of example of something that a country that defeated white supremacy, to see it kind of coming back like that is very disconcerting.
And just finally, because we are speaking about Europe, and you did hint at that, the fact that we have seen Europe move more and more right, particularly ideologically in terms of the political parties that are coming into government and governance. I am just wondering about, because you also spoke about responsibility, or at least I thought about it, the media. There is a lot of disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Is there enough work being done to reflect the narrative as it is, not only just in South Africa, but around issues around migration?
No, I don't think so. I think the whole issue has been deeply and systematically misrepresented by the press. I don't want to call it the mainstream press because that's kind of what the far right used to diss us. But certainly by let's say in the UK where I grew up, the press has become hysterically right wing, very anti-immigration. Increasingly, it was always kind of subtle racism, but now it's kind of becoming more explicit. And I do think the conversation about this has been kind of hijacked by the far right, even in the kind of more mainstream media. This is putting aside like those kind of sort of far right chat rooms, where I mean the fact that Tommy Robinson, a guy who was kind of dismissed as this extremist white supremacist football hooligan only a decade ago, is now doing the rounds in the White House, but also in right-wing media around the world, just shows how much the narrative has shifted. So no, I think that it unfortunately, to a large extent, the people who are more cosmopolitan, who want to see diversity, who want to see a world in which different races, such as they are, can get on better, those voices are being marginalized, basically.
And just to end on what might be considered a more provocative note, but it's not really, it's just about reality, the truth that criminals are not only black or brown. There is the case of Tim and Mel Viljoen, who were sought by the Special Security Services, who were arrested in the United States. And I think it's because of some criminal activity that they had in, I think it's Palm Beach. Do you know anything about that, Tim, that case in particular? But just whether particularly white South Africans are seen as people who are capable of crime, because I remember seeing actually one on an I special list seen as somebody who is dangerous. Is that dawning on those who are pushing a racist narrative that criminals are criminals no matter their color?
You know what? I don't know enough about how that narrative has shifted as a result of this case to answer that question. But you only have to think about it for 5 minutes to think that it's an absolutely absurd notion that certain people from a certain class or a certain race are criminals and these other people can't be criminals. Anyone, I guess, in the right circumstances can be a criminal. It just depends on what's driving you. And yes, it's a ridiculous idea that that crime is associated, should be more associated with one race rather than another. And if these cases are helping, loosen that idea or get rid of it, then yes, that would be a positive step. But I just don't know.
All right, Tim, thank you so much for your time, and a pleasure speaking to you. Tim Cox, Reuters Southern Africa Chief Correspondent and author of Lagos, Portrait of Africa's Biggest Metropolis, just speaking to us about the article that Reuters put out about a South African family that it was a case study, as I mentioned, that is considering leaving America. Some, they report, are coming back to South Africa, despite the narrative that white South Africans are being persecuted, led by President Donald Trump in South Africa.